All right, hello and welcome back to the Systems Development Project Management module course. In today's segment, we're going to look at Study Unit 2, which covers overview of the Scrum framework. We're going to look at Agile planning and Agile requirements management practices. And of course, Unit 2 consists of Chapters 3, Chapter 4, as well as Chapter 15 in the prescribed textbook. So we're going to go through quite a number of learning outcomes. So firstly, we're going to deep dive into the Scrum framework and kind of break it up and look at all the associated elements of sprints, backlog, and Scrum meetings. We're also going to look a little bit deeply into some of the key Scrum roles, predominantly of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team. And then we're going to look into the fundamental Scrum values and principles. And of course, this follows on the back foot of the, the review that we did on the Agile principles and values as espoused in the Agile Manifesto. Then we're going to get into Agile planning. So we're going to look at sort of Agile planning approach and some of the associated practices of Agile planning. Then we're going to look at all the different techniques and tools and practices that are used to capture, to analyze, to document requirements, such as user stories, user personas, epics, and the product backlog. And then in Learning Outcomes 7 and 8, we're going to look at the product or the project vision, as well as the product or project roadmap, then conclude with a little bit of a feasibility assessment or feasibility analysis by looking at the exploratory 360 assessment, and then look at functional decomposition as an Agile planning tool. And then we're going to close off by briefly looking at the project charter and the role that it plays both in classical as well as Agile projects. All right, we're going to kick off with the very first learning outcome, which deals with the Scrum framework. And of course, we want to unpack all the associated elements of the Scrum framework, namely sprints, product backlog, and Scrum meetings. So the image shown here kind of gives a high-level overview of what this framework looks like. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to just look at different sections and different elements of the Scrum framework and how everything effectively fits in together. When we talk about the Scrum framework, and we are effectively talking about a framework or a tool, if you will, that Agile teams use in order to structure and manage the delivery of their work. And importantly, the Scrum framework is also referred to as an empirical process, and that's kind of important in the definition. By empirical process, what we mean is Scrum as a framework is inherently a process that is geared towards continuous improvement and observation. So what that means is a lot of what is encompassed in the Scrum framework is looking at how we do things and, using trial and error, using a lot of experimenting, and then, using mistakes in the way that we do things to effectively, improve ultimately how we do things. So an empirical process, therefore, is a process of continuous experimentation and observation, so lots of trial and error in Scrum, but all of this, of course, towards frequent adaptations and frequent inspections. And of course, the Scrum framework, of course, being an Agile framework, means that it works best in project environments where there is high levels of uncertainty. Of course, on the opposite side is, of the empirical process, is the more, of course, defined and the more predictive process, again, which is made up of sort of well-defined process, very specific outcomes being generated. And of course, we know that works ideally for projects that are not very don't have high levels of uncertainty, where there is high levels of predictability and set level of requirements. Another important aspect about the Scrum framework is that it is an adaptive solution process. And what that means is it is a process where the solution is defined progressively. So again, the concepts that we learned about the agile fundamental processes we learned of in study unit 1, of course, will start featuring throughout each of the study units. So Scrum is an adaptive solution process, and of course, this means that the solution and the requirements are progressively refined. And then Scrum is also an adaptive process, which means that the solution is broken down into short, fixed-length sprints, and we call these iterations or sprints. And at the end of the project, the team kind of reflects and pauses, evaluates, refines, and reworks and improves the process. Right. So the diagram there shows the couple of elements that are contained or effectively make up the Scrum framework. These are firstly sprints, and the second element is the product backlog, and the third element, which is quite a big component as well, are all the different bits and pieces of the Scrum meetings. And there are effectively 4 meetings, namely the sprint planning meeting, which happens at the start of an iteration. Then you've got what we call the daily Scrum or the daily stand-up meeting, and this happens in between or within the iteration. Then you've got the sprint review, which happens at the end of the iteration, and you've got the sprint retrospective, which also happens towards the end of the iteration. Right. So all of these different elements, together with the different role players, then make up effectively the Scrum framework. Right. So let's start with the first element of the Scrum framework, which are the Scrum meetings, and particularly looking at the sprints. By very definition, a sprint is described as a fixed length or a time-boxed iteration, and typically it lasts from about 2 to 4 weeks, but certainly not longer than that. And that is the duration that the project team has effectively to complete work and to deliver some sort of value or working software for the project, right? So a sprint is effectively a time-boxed iteration, like we said, of about 2 to 4 weeks, where the team works together in order to deliver some sort of value. Now, the sprint is purposefully time-boxed, and what that means is it runs for a specific set of time, and that time is set for each and every single sprint, right? So, if it's 2 to 4 weeks, it means each and every sprint or each and every iteration, will be fixed according to that specific time frame. Now, just in comparison, the traditional development approach, just for interest's sake, uses not what we call a time-boxed iteration, but more of a schedule-boxed iteration. And what this means is that the duration of the project and the timelines can be extended to accommodate the scope of work, right? And that's the primary difference between sort of your traditional schedule-boxed iteration and a strict time-boxed iteration. In a sprint, we only have the set time to deliver work. It is, for example, 2 to 4 weeks. If there is additional work that comes in during the sprint, we don't, adjust the timeline, but rather we change, what we do and what can be delivered. Whereas in the traditional sense, if additional work comes into the iteration, that iteration can be extended to incorporate that additional scope change as well. Right. The second element is the product backlog. And what the product backlog is essentially is a carefully maintained, structured a prioritized list of work items. So effectively, the product backlog is in essence a cupboard in which all the activities and the work deliverables that the team need to conclude in the sprint or for a project are contained in. And typically that list is in a prioritized fashion. So from items that are, at the top of the backlog are prioritized and ready for development. And as you go down, those are items that require further refinement and unpacking. So a product backlog is then a structured, carefully maintained, prioritized list or queue of work items. And these are the requirements that the project team is going to be delivering on. We've already touched the point that typically the requirements in Agile are presented in the form of user stories, and we'll get into the details of user stories a little bit later on in the lecture today. But effectively, user stories are just a way of presenting user requirements in such a manner that the requirement is presented to the user in a short, informal, precise description that kind of gives a very clear indication of what the user requirement is, and most importantly from the user's perspective. Now, just another comment that when you look at the product backlog, as you can see on that item there on the image there, it of course contains the list of prioritized requirements, but it can contain other things as well, typically a list of bugs and defects and other technical items that need to be prioritized going into the iteration or the sprint. Now, in Scrum, the responsibility of defining and managing and upkeep of the product backlog falls on the product owner. So the product owner is ultimately responsible for the product backlog, and the product owner is responsible to prioritize the product backlog and ensure that the development team are working on items that have been groomed and prioritized. And as you can see there, so the product backlog can be limited to 2 or 3 sprints, but of course, we cannot give a definitive view of what the product backlog will look like, for example, 6 months down the line, because the principle in Agile, like we said, is we want to have just enough information, just enough requirements in order for us to complete the sprint at hand. So as such, the product backlog will typically sit with items that are 2 to 3 weeks that have been groomed and are ready for the team to start picking on and start working on. Right, the next element in the Scrum framework is the product backlog grooming or refinement. And what this is just an informal meeting where the product owner and the project team collaborate together in order to refine, to prioritize, and prepare the product backlog for upcoming sprints. One of the key characteristics of the product backlog is that it has got to be kept and maintained in a state that is prioritized, such that the development team at any given point in time are able to pick items from this prioritized list, pull them into a sprint, into an iteration, and have those delivered. So as such, the product backlog grooming or refinement meeting is then a session where the development team together with the product owner sit and sort of remove and create and reassess the user stories, of course prioritize the requirements or the user stories, also assign estimates in terms of what is the work effort that will be required to deliver those items. And of course, one of the key outcomes of the grooming session or the backlog grooming or refinement session is the outcome of breaking out those user stories into smaller deliverable items.